All right, guys, so now today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to talk about
The moon.
The moon. We're going to talk about one of the greatest scientific achievements of the human race, which happened about 50 years ago. It's about when humans walked on the moon.
Like Neil Armstrong.
Right. So all this started with the space race. And the space race was between the United States and the Soviet Union. Remember, we talked about the Soviet Union. What do we call the Soviet Union now?
Russia.
Russia, right? But it used to be the Soviet Union. It used to have a lot of other countries around it that were all part of their country, and they also had influence over a lot of the other countries in Europe as well. And they were basically the enemy of the United States. There was a race to see who could control the world, and there was a fear that whichever side won would end up controlling the other country. That we were afraid in the United States that the Soviet Union would end up controlling the United States if we let them get too strong. So the space race began in the 1950s after World War II. The stakes were very high because whoever controlled space, there was a feeling like they could have military control of the world because they could send missiles down from space and there would be very little warning. So the space race really began in 1957. The Soviet Union started out ahead in the race because they sent the first satellite up into space, making an orbit around the Earth, and that was called Sputnik 1. So that was a very big achievement for the Soviet Union. In 1959, the Soviet Union sent the first satellite that actually started to orbit around the sun instead of the Earth, so it went further out. And they also had the first satellite with no people on it crash land into the moon. So that was the first time that a human machine, a space traveling machine, actually contacted the moon. So that was a big deal as well. So things started going really quickly at this point. The United States, the President of the United States at the time, John F. Kennedy, in 1961, made a major priority of the United States that we were going to get ahead in the space race and that we were going to put a man on the moon. In 1961, the Soviet Union put the first satellite up in orbit of Earth with a person on it. So that was the first man in space. His name was Yuri Gagarin. And in response to that, the United States created NASA. Have you guys heard of NASA?
No.
NASA is our national space agency. So we never had an actual space agency before that. But after the Soviets put a man in space, we decided it was time. We made a special space agency that was dedicated to getting spaceships up in the air, up in orbit, and to get a man on the moon. In 1966, the Soviet Union was again the first to do what's called a soft landing on the moon. A soft landing is where the spacecraft actually lands intact in one piece on the moon rather than just crashing into it, which means that there are machines which can, unmanned machines which can drive on the moon, what they call like rovers, that can drive around on the moon and can even collect rock samples, things like that, and do experiments. The United States also managed to do a soft landing 4 months after the Soviet Union. But the real prize was to have people walking on the moon and then coming back to Earth, which at the time seemed almost impossible. I mean, it was such an enormous project to get men up into space at all. How are you going to get them onto the moon? And then all without any help, without any kind of engineers or anything, just those same people, how are you going to get them all the way back into space? It's still amazing to me that they were able to do it. So let's watch a video over here, which gives some information. The first spacecraft that got to the moon and landed on the moon and came back was called Apollo 11. So the earlier Apollo missions, numbers 1 through 10, did smaller missions. They got up in space, they got in orbit around the moon, but Apollo 11 was the first one that actually landed. So let's watch this video that tells the story of how they
But
did
we
it.
won, right?
Well, we were the first ones to get onto the moon.
You're looking at one of the most incredible moments in human history. That's Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walking on the moon. Okay, maybe you've seen this clip before, but think about that for a second. They're on the moon, a celestial object nearly 240,000 miles into outer space. That distance is like flying all the way around the Earth 9.5 times. Millions of people around the world watched on July 16, 1969, as Apollo 11, carrying astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, launched from Cape Kennedy, Florida, and disappeared into the sky. It was the climax of years of preparation and research, and the pinnacle moment of the so-called space race between the United States and Soviet Union, a years-long rivalry to compete for dominance in space exploration. For the 8 days following the launch, the world awaited the return of the would-be heroes. So what actually happened between here and here? So let's start with the components of the ship that were discarded one by one until this became this. Here's the rocket that sent the astronauts into space, the Saturn V. The 3 stages of the Saturn V each played a different role in launching Apollo on a path to the moon. We'll get to that later. On top of the rocket is the actual Apollo spacecraft. It's made up of 3 parts too. There's the lunar module, the component that would eventually land on the lunar surface, the service module, which had propulsion systems for course corrections and entering and escaping orbit, and the command module, where our 3 heroes were for most of the mission. And last but not least, this is the launch escape system, which was designed to pull the command module away from the rocket if something went wrong during launch. Together, all these pieces made up the Saturn V rocket and Apollo 11 spacecraft. But it's the way they came apart that made the moon landing happen. The Saturn V's first stage launched Apollo, carrying the spacecraft 42 miles above the Earth and reaching a speed of about 6,000 miles per hour. The first stage then detached, and once the Saturn V's second stage kicked in, the now needless launch escape system jettisoned too. The second stage propelled the spacecraft even farther and faster into space, and after it detached, the third stage of the rocket fired briefly to knock Apollo into a parking orbit 103 miles above the Earth's surface. Here, final checks were made, and the Saturn V fired again to set Apollo on course to the moon, in a move called the translunar injection. Once the spacecraft propelled away from Earth, the Saturn V's job was done. Now, the astronauts needed to pull off a mid-flight maneuver to reconfigure the ship so the crew could access the lunar module, which had been stored in a protective compartment during launch. To do this, the command service module detached and flipped 180 degrees, docking with the lunar module and extracting it. In the process, they ditched the third, now useless stage of the Saturn rocket. This whole high-stakes launch process only took about 3.5 hours, and this, the completed Apollo spacecraft, was the end result. For the next 3 days, Apollo coasted through space, until it finally reached its target and was pulled into orbit by the moon's gravity. This is where the crew split up. Armstrong and Aldrin transferred to the lunar module, named Eagle, and slowly descended toward the surface, while Collins continued to circle the moon in the command module, called Columbia. Now, here comes another tricky part, landing on the moon. To make this historic moment happen, Eagle turned and used its engine to slow its momentum and ultimately touch down on the lunar surface.
The Eagle has landed.
The moonwalk was broadcast live on television, immortalizing Neil Armstrong's words here.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
After about 21.5 hours on the moon, Eagle performed the first launch from a celestial body that wasn't Earth, leaving its landing gear behind and timing its ascent with Columbia's path in lunar orbit to rejoin the spacecraft. Once Armstrong and Aldrin transferred back into the command module, the lunar module was no longer needed. Just like before, Apollo needed to break out of orbit. This maneuver was called the trans-Earth injection, and began the 2.5-day journey home. Upon approaching its entry point into Earth's atmosphere and no longer needing its propulsion engines, Apollo jettisoned the service module and prepared for re-entry, protected by the now exposed heat shield on the bottom of the command module.
Apollo blazes across the heavens, coming back to Earth at 25,000 miles an hour.
Parachutes deployed, and Columbia splashed down safely into the Pacific Ocean. And what was once a 3,000-ton behemoth of rocket, fuel, and freight was reduced to this: a small command module floating in the ocean, carrying 3 astronauts and rock samples collected from the surface of the moon.
So what I really want you guys to understand over there was the principle of how the ship that got them into space was divided into many pieces or stages. So most of that big tube that got them into space was called the Saturn V rocket. So that was actually what was attached to the Apollo spacecraft, but it wasn't really the spacecraft. All those parts, those stages of the rocket contain fuel. And so the bottom stage is just full of fuel. That fuel is meant to get them to a certain height in the sky, and then they detach it, they jettison it, and it falls back to Earth. Obviously, they know where it's going to fall and where there's not going to be any people there. Then, once all the fuel is gone, that first stage is dropped off, then the second stage starts burning. That one's full of fuel too. That one gets them up even higher. And the good thing at that point is you don't need to carry that first stage anymore that's full of fuel. So it doesn't take as much. The second stage drops off, and now the third stage of the Saturn rocket gets them all the way out of the atmosphere and into orbit around the Earth. The last thing that third stage does is at exactly the right moment, when they're in orbit, it kicks them towards the moon. Once you are on your way towards the moon, you don't need as much energy anymore because you're further away from Earth, you're out of the strong gravitational pull of the Earth, and it's a lot easier to get into orbit around the moon. Now, while they're on their way to orbit around the moon, at this point, the two parts of the Apollo spacecraft detach. So you have the actual part that the astronauts are in. That's called the command module. That part is attached to something called the service module. The service module has extra oxygen, water, things like that for the spacecraft and for the astronauts. So the command module turns around and it attaches to something called the lunar module, which is inside the Saturn III rocket. It pulls the lunar module out, and now you just have the command module attached to the lunar module. The last piece of the Saturn rocket is jettisoned, all right? It breaks away and floats away, and that's gone forever. So now the two of the astronauts get out of the command module and they go into the lunar module. That's Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. The third astronaut, whose name was Collins, he stays in the command module. He never went down to the moon. He had to stay in orbit in the command module around the moon. The lunar module is the one that went down and landed on the surface of the moon. And the other name for that was the Eagle. They called the lunar module the Eagle, and when the lunar module landed on the surface of the moon, that's what they said in mission control. They said the Eagle has landed. That's one very famous quote. And of course, the other famous quote is what Neil Armstrong said. The first step he took onto the moon, he said, "That's one small step for a man, but one giant leap for mankind." In other words, it just looks like any other step that you might take anywhere, just any other regular small step, but the meaning of it was huge for mankind. It was our first step onto another planet or another moon in space. Ever since life developed on Earth, it was a huge leap for life and a huge leap for mankind. So let's watch this thing. It's called a simulation of the actual moon landing. So we're going to watch this. This is not, simulation means it's not real. It's like a computer, like a kind of like a cartoon movie that they made because they really didn't have cameras to show what was happening at the time. No, obviously no cameras on the moon to show it. So you see that's the command module on the left, and that's the lunar module on the right. They detach, and the lunar module starts to go down towards the moon. Now remember, the lunar module can't crash land. That's very important. So they have to have rockets inside the lunar module to slow it down when it's descending. There's the rocket firing to slow it down.
When does it stop?
When it lands.
When does it land?
You can see on the right, the second number from the top is how high it is from the surface of the moon in feet. So there it's at 10,000 feet from the surface of the moon. 5,000, 4,000, 3, 2, 1,
Go.
500, 400, 300, 200, 100, coming down.
And 0. That
The
water?
eagle has landed. No, it's dust on the surface of the moon.
The eagle has landed. It looks so rusty.
It's not rusty. That's just artificial color put into the picture. So actually, one thing you guys should know about the moon landing is it almost didn't work. There was something wrong with their measurements, and they overshot the space where they were supposed to land. And a lot of the moon is covered with what?
Holes.
Holes, which we call, what's that? What do we call those holes on the surface of planets?
I don't know.
Craters.
Craters.
And so they're rough, and they're also boulders and craters. And so when they were trying to land, all they saw, they couldn't find the smooth spot they picked out. All they saw were boulders and craters, and they had to steer manually the eagle and to look for a smooth space where they could land. They only had 30 seconds of fuel left to fly when Neil Armstrong finally saw the place, a smooth place where he could land. So a lot of things could have happened differently, and a lot of things could have been disaster. And like I said, a lot of things had to work perfectly. Remember, they needed a soft landing, right? People are pretty soft and can't get crushed when they land. So in order to make that soft landing, they had to fire their booster rockets against downward to slow the craft down so that it wouldn't come in to the ground too quickly. So that was something that, you know, they additionally had to do that made this thing much more difficult. So after they landed on the moon, the other amazing thing, to me the most amazing thing, is how did they launch the Eagle back? They had to launch the Eagle back into space. They had to meet up exactly with the command module and reattach to it before they could come back to Earth. To me, that's the most amazing thing that I don't understand. It took a whole huge Saturn V rocket to leave the Earth, and then all they had was that little lunar module to land with. And how could they get enough fuel in there? Do you guys have any idea why it was easier to leave the surface of the moon than? Do you, Ian? Why was it easier to leave the surface of the moon
Because
than
you don't
the
have to
Earth?
search for Because like you don't have to go in like craters.
Why do you need less fuel to leave the moon? Less fuel and not as big of a rocket.
Because when you're on top of Earth, you might have to like when it slows down, it might go into the sea.
No, the reason you need less fuel and less force to leave the moon is because it is much
Faster.
smaller than Earth. What decides how much gravity an object has? Why does the Earth have so much gravity, but, this little box has very little gravity. Nothing's pulling me towards the box. What determines how much gravity an object has? Its size, its mass. So the Earth is so much bigger than the moon that it has much more gravity. It takes much more fuel and much more force to leave Earth than it does to leave the moon. So if the moon had been the same size as Earth, they never could have landed on the moon and left again. And you'll see also when people walk on the moon, you're going to see what that looks like because it doesn't look anything like walking on the Earth.
The Saturn V rocket that lifted the Apollo 11 spacecraft out of Earth's orbit had been reduced to its final stage, the S-4B. The Command and Service Module, or CSM, separated from the S-4B, turned through 180 degrees and docked with the Lunar Module, or LEM. The now combined CSM and LEM pulled away from the S-4B rocket, proceeding on its roughly 250,000-mile journey to the Moon during the translunar coast phase. Almost 3 days later, the spacecraft entered lunar orbit. The crew spent the next 25 hours performing various systems, checks and tests while in orbit around the Moon. In preparation for landing, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin transferred to the LEM while Michael Collins remained in the CSM. The CSM undocked and separated from the LEM. Now functioning as two separate vehicles, the CSM was redesignated Columbia and the LEM Eagle. Eagle's descent orbit initiation began, followed by the powered descent initiation. After 102 hours and 45 minutes of travelling through space, Eagle became the first manned spacecraft to land on the Moon. Once safely on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin performed a checkout of all systems and prepared for their historic moonwalk. 109 hours and 42 minutes after launch, Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the lunar surface. Eagle ascended from the lunar surface to rendezvous and dock with Columbia, which had been orbiting the Moon during the lunar landing. Columbia docked with Eagle, and Armstrong and Aldrin reunited with Collins in the CSM. The LEM ascent stage was jettisoned, and the CSM entered the trans-Earth injection phase to make the voyage back to Earth. The service section of the CSM was ejected before entering Earth's atmosphere. Finally, 195 hours, 18 minutes and 35 seconds after departing the Earth, the command module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on the 24th of July after travelling a total distance of over 800,000 nautical miles.
So just that little piece was all that was left at the end, and it landed in the ocean.
Why does it have to land in the ocean?
Because they didn't have any rockets to slow it down. It only had parachutes, so it came in fast and they needed somewhere soft to land. So since Apollo 11 in 1969, there were five more manned landings by the United States on the Moon. They all went successfully. No Americans were ever left on the Moon or crashed on the Moon. So a total of 12 Americans walked on the Moon, but no other people have ever landed on the Moon or walked on the Moon. And we stopped sending manned missions to the Moon about more than 40 years ago. So they did all this in just a few years, all the manned missions to the moon, and then they stopped because basically there was no point in doing it more. They'd achieved everything they wanted to achieve. You know, they proved that we could do interplanetary flight, but the bottom line is the moon just isn't that interesting. It's just a big hunk of rock, and once you've gotten enough pieces of rock to analyze, you really can't get anything more about going back to the moon. It's very expensive. So we haven't gone back to the moon since then. So we're gonna watch one more thing. We're gonna watch the actual camera footage from Neil Armstrong walking on the moon in 1969.
20 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Take shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drift into the right a little. 20, down a half. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The 11-foot beds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches. I'm going to step off the limb now. That's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind. Tony, this is so great you can't believe it. I believe it, Charlie. It's raining, Johnny. Look at it go, would you, Charlie? You got all your steering to get straight. Oh, this is going to be some kind of different ride. Hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale. Da 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 da. Hippity hopping along. 1 ignition. Right away, Houston. Vector good. We're burning flight. Roger. Looks good, flight. Roger, make shot flight. Roger. Stand by for splashdown. Recovery, America, stable water, the crew is gone.
Because the gravity is so much less, you jump and you go much higher and you stay in the air for much longer. That's the last video, because I know you guys don't like to have too many videos.
It's okay.
Well, we can watch more later, but that's all we need to understand how man got to the moon and back, which I want you guys to know about because it's one of the most important events that has happened in the history of the human race, and it was only 50 years ago. So do you guys have any questions about the first moon landing?
Oh.
What's your question, Ian?
So they didn't go to the right landing, right?
They missed the landing spot they planned because there was something that went wrong with their calculations. So they went past it. They had to find a completely new one just using sight.
So they need to find it with their own eyes.
They had to use their eyes and find the spot. And they only had a couple of minutes of extra fuel. And they made it and they found the place.
And were the ones that were turning blue doing this?
The people turning blue were the ones on Earth who were watching and waiting for them to land and knew they only had a few seconds of fuel left. So they were holding their breath. What happens when you hold your breath for too long? You turn blue.
Really?
So that's what they were saying. I don't think they were really blue, but that's what the expression the guy said. He goes, we got a bunch of guys that were turning blue over here before they landed. Believe me, there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of things that can go wrong and have gone wrong. And many astronauts have died.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, I know one. One famous.
Well, let's not get too far away from the subject.
Or should we say
so
six?
if you guys don't have any other questions about the moon landing, then we'll stop this one, okay?
And
We'll say
Dad,
bye-bye.
so somebody died